Thanks a lot, Emmanuel, for being with us. So perhaps
Pleasure.
for people who don't know you, could you tell us who you are and what are your current themes of exploration?
Sure. Firstly, hello. Nice to be with you all today. My name is Emmanuel Vaughan-Lee. I'm speaking to you from Northern California in a little town called Point Reyes Station. It's about an hour north of San Francisco. My background is professionally as a filmmaker. I also founded and run and the executive editor of a magazine called Emergence Magazine, which explores the threads connecting ecology, culture, and spirituality. We're an online and print publication. And I'm also a Naqshbandi Sufi teacher. So I kind of walk in a few different worlds, although the themes all intersect in my work and my spiritual practice and the magazine's publishing. The themes that we focus on, ecology, culture, and spirituality, are really looking at how these fields that were once upon a time in a land long far away, long ago, together. We lived in relationship with the living world in a way that was in balance. Our cultures were built upon that, and our spiritual traditions from all over the world were woven into that fabric of relationship with culture and our ecology, and that has become severed over the last several thousand years, especially over the last few hundred years due to colonization, industrialization, and the many otherizations that we're very good at implementing as a Western culture. And so the work that I'm involved in and have been for some time is really to try to tell stories that weave those threads back together and talk about the importance of not looking at these different aspects of our lives as separate. That in order to live a fulfilled life, one needs to understand that we are part of an interconnected living system in all respects. And so the stories I'm drawn to tell explore that from various avenues, whether it be focused on ecological issues or social issues or culture issues as the entrance point, but always looking at how they're woven together. So that's kind of a broad overview, if you will.
It's a big overview, and it has many aspects that you are touching on. And how did it come about? How did you get into these different aspects and your personality and your work and all this, from ecological to spirituality to community? How did it come that this is your thread in your life?
Before I was a filmmaker, I was a jazz musician, and that's really what I'm only qualified to do. That's what I studied in university, composition and jazz improvisation. And when I was in my mid-20s, and I had a successful career already by then, I actually decided to leave that and pursue filmmaking because I felt that I wasn't able to express myself creatively through music in the way that I wanted to by more literally exploring some of the questions and ideas that were really coming to the surface within me. And that stemmed very much from my own spiritual background as a practicing Sufi, wanting to find outer expressions of my own spiritual path, of really wanting to seek ways of finding examples of how a spiritual value set is put into practice in the world. What happens when that doesn't happen? And specifically now at this time, and this was kind of at the turn of the century, 2000, when there are so many questions about how we are going to be able to live on this planet in a way that is in balance and does have a viable future. What role do spiritual values have in finding a way to return to that balance? So it was both kind of a personal desire to express my own spiritual path, but also to find and seek out the relevance that it has now at this time.
And one keyword is community, as I understood. What does it mean to you, and where do you come from in that aspect?
Well, I think everything is in community all the time. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we are constantly in a complex web of relationships with everything around us, whether that be human or non-human. And of course, human community is always important on so many levels, but so is the recognition of the non-human community that we are a part of, but have silenced and tried to control, and have now destroyed, and are continuing to destroy. So community, I think, is a key aspect of the work I've been involved in, but also trying to broaden our understanding of what community means, and community not just from a human-centric point of view, but to really broaden it back into its original state of being, which included many voices and many components that were broader than a human sense of community.
And so, for instance, in your childhood, you grew up within a community, and then I guess with the time, of course, you entered different formats of living together. What is your current setup? Do you live in a community where you are now, and how was it, or what did that bring you to grow up within a community in the north of London?
Yeah, so I was raised in a somewhat unique environment. You could call it a modern day ashram type setting in North London, where my parents' spiritual teacher, a Sufi teacher, who had studied, was the first Western woman to really be trained in this specific form of mystical tradition of Sufism in the 1950s and 60s, came back to England and taught. My parents were students of hers, and we all lived in a house together in North London, and she had an apartment downstairs and we lived upstairs, and every day, between 80 and 100 of her students would come every afternoon from 2 in the afternoon till 8 in the evening. So I grew up around a lot of people, with a lack of personal space. The garden was filled with her students. They gathered outside her door before she opened in the afternoon. People were always ringing on the doorbell because something was coming up they needed help with, and my parents were very close with their teacher and assisting her. So I grew up in that kind of community setting, and when I moved to America as a teenager, it was different. We had a house that was separate from that kind of environment. So my childhood was very much steeped in a community type setting of people who were always around, people who were interested in spiritual life, and that definitely obviously influenced my life and my work in various ways. But my community setting right now is my wife, my 2 children, and my dog, and I'm quite happy with that setting. I think there are pluses and minuses to living in a shared communal setting. So I am fond of having doors that I can shut and have a little personal space.
Agree.
And actually, nowadays you seem to have it translated in a very specific way in your work. Like in the printed version of Emergence Magazine, you're talking about awakening a sense of place and belonging for your readers. So I guess this is still something that you're trying to infuse, but of course in a very different way, on different formats. How do you think you can manage to awake that sense of place and belonging for your readers?
Well, it's one of the themes that we've been exploring in Emergence since we launched a few years ago, and also a theme I've been interested in exploring in my work, which is reconnecting to place. Obviously this is a generalization, but many of us are very transient. We don't live in the place that we were born. We don't live in the place that our parents were born, or our grandparents were born, or our great-grandparents were born. And our sense of home is truncated as a result. It's small compared to a sense of home which is built on multi-generations of being in relationship to a place, which for the majority of human history was how we functioned, which was based on those series of relationships and connections that were built generation after generation upon a place that we lived. And so that sense of connection, that understanding, that knowledge, that depth of intimacy with a landscape was just part of how we lived our lives. Of course, people migrated to cities for thousands of years, but not in any way near the scale that we do now. And one of the reasons I think that we are dealing with so many challenges about how to live in balance is because we've become so disconnected from a sense of connection of relationship to place and to home and belonging in a simple way of understanding that we are part of a landscape, we are part of the earth. And if you grow up in a place and you've been part of that place for generations, it's kind of just unconsciously part of your understanding, even if you don't articulate it by saying we need to have a relationship to place. It's just built in with traditions, rituals, and connections and everything else. And so if we're going to try to return to a sense of balance, we can't just talk about sustainability and shifting to a green economy or what kind of, food we're going to eat. Those are all parts of it. But I think there's a deeper connection that needs to be made, which is to our sense of belonging and home. And that doesn't mean that we have to go back to where our ancestors lived, but more about how can we put down roots where we are, even if we are going to be transient, because the economy, forces us to shift our jobs and shift where we live. But even if you're only living somewhere for a few years, if you could understand its history, if you can know the people who lived there before, the original inhabitants of that land, if you can understand the non-human, creatures that lived there, the plants, the birds, all of those things offer an entry point into building relationships and connections with a place. If we have those relationships and connections in place, then we are going to feel like we are part of that place in a deeper way. We're going to care about that place in a different way. We're going to be more protective of that place in a good way, meaning we will be less likely to destroy that place or allow it to be taken advantage of or exploited, and all the things that happen to landscapes and places when people are no longer there and connected to protect and be part of that ecosystem. So, it's a different way of connecting to place than we did for millennia, but I think it's one that's so crucial as we step into this next era of trying to save what small pieces of untouched land that we have and find ways to live on the land that hasn't been untouched, but, must be preserved and connected with humans in a different way than it has in the past few hundred years.
And is that connected to this notion of oneness that you've been very interested in, like starting from an individual practice of experiencing oneness, notably through Sufism, to then more also something that your father has been working on, a global awakening of consciousness? Is that of the oneness? Is that something that can allow us to, exactly what you say, to create that connection again?
Yes, definitely. I mean, oneness from a spiritual perspective within my own Sufi tradition is it's a fundamental philosophy and tenet of that underlies the mystical tradition of Sufism, but other mystical traditions as well, which is that everything is one, and this idea that you are separate is an illusion, and the spiritual journey is essentially peeling back those veils of illusion to reveal that you are all one. And this notion of God as an old white man in the sky is definitely one of those illusions, that the divine creation is all around us all the time, and we are part of that. So that's something that spiritual traditions like Sufism have taught and for hundreds and thousands of years. But it's also represented in indigenous wisdom traditions, which were very much rooted in a connection with place and with the earth and with the non-human world. And so this concept of oneness was expressed in both those forms. For a long time, but it's something that, again, our Western society didn't necessarily agree with, because they like to separate things out. The scientific models that have now turned into the fundamental tenets of what runs the world were about separating everything into silos and not about those connections. So returning to this fundamental spiritual truth, returning to this fundamental indigenous wisdom, returning to essentially a reflection of how the ecological systems function is part of the journey that we're going on right now. We're going through it because we were forced to look at what happens when we live in a world that's based on duality and that says, us versus them, and puts humans at the top of the food chain. So my father's work was really about talking about how does that fundamental spiritual understanding of oneness, which is part of the personal individual relationship to the divine or God or a higher truth, higher consciousness, how does that translate into a much larger way of functioning on a planetary level, returning back to how things existed for the whole of human history, but with the understanding that we've become disconnected from that reality, and we need to consciously now embrace that philosophy and that way of being if we are going to survive. So yeah, that's been a big part of my work. It's also been interesting to see that, over the last 20 years that I've been involved in this, that more and more people from all different sorts of field are starting to put more value on a holistic way of doing things. 20 years ago, you talked about a holistic approach to food or medicine, and you were a fringe hippie. And of course, the hippies usually were the first ones to make those positive steps. And so, 20 years later, people are starting to talk about a holistic way to approach medicine or food or agriculture or architecture or urban planning or economic systems or whatnot, and they're not laughed out of the room, and that spiritual values are starting to have more of a relevance for people as they see that compassion, empathy, generosity, stewardship, service, reverence, those are all very, very relevant if we're going to find ways of being that can support not only the human systems but also the non-human systems.
And maybe if you share all these big topics, where do you start, for example, in your daily life, in your own meditation practice, for example? Can you give us an insight for one who might not be too much in touch with this or hears this for the first time or doesn't know about Sufism? What does one start, or you start every day?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do adhere to I guess the philosophy that you should practice what you preach, or at least try to. And I think that although it's a cliche and people laugh it off, I do think that small actions can make big change, and they do start with the individual. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be systemic changes, and there shouldn't be policies that are implemented by governments that can help support societal changes and shifts, but they also need to be held within the individual. And that doesn't mean everyone has to have a meditation practice. Everyone has their own way of wanting to seek greater meaning, find truth, and whatnot. But for me, my life was always grounded in my spiritual practice, and so that's how my day begins, with just a silent meditation practice. That in Sufism, we work with the energy of love as a way to still the mind and to remove the barriers of separation between you, the individual, and the divine, which is everything else, and also includes the individual. And so the meditation practice I have is just a simple meditation practice of stilling the mind by creating love in one's heart, and it's like the energy of love can still the mind. It can quieten the mind. It can take over one's thoughts and then take you away from your own, ego into a much larger sense of connection and relationship. And so that's how I start my day. It's just a simple hour-long practice of a heart-based meditation, and that is a centering foundation of how I go about my day and how I go about my life.
And did you notice or observe any changes in that urgency that we are, at least in the last couple of months, and also in the perspective?
I think that the world has gotten noisier and noisier and noisier in my lifetime. it's become more complicated. It's become faster. It's become more toxic, on all sorts of levels. And I think that actually makes it harder in some ways to practice meditation. There are so many things that are just always bombarding us all the time. And we take all of those things in, even if we're not aware of them. And a meditation practice is about kind of getting rid of those things so that one can return to the empty space that is inherently within us. And so I think we have to work harder to do that. And I think that's only become harder in the context of the pandemic, where we, have anxiety from everyone around us, our society, filling the space. Naturally, people are anxious about their health. People are anxious about their jobs. People are anxious about all the uncertainty that is in the air, that is around us, and so that creates an atmosphere that is challenging to be around. And I think we've all experienced that. Just as you walk down the street and you're experiencing that as you see people with masks, everybody concerned about their health. Perhaps less so in Germany and the United States, but it's still there, and that takes a toll that we're just even consciously of. Maybe we're more tired, maybe we're more agitated. We're not calm and quiet and centered naturally just by being exposed to this environment. So we have to work harder to return to that sense of calm and quiet inside of ourselves. But it also makes a meditation practice, I think, even more important because it gives us the tools to be able to try to mitigate what we're experiencing, which is a bombardment of all these different things around us all the time. And it can help us create and maintain a balance inside of ourselves, so we're not overcome emotionally to the point where we become unbalanced, so that we have some sort of center we can return to in ourselves each day. So I think that meditation is harder and only more important. Meditation being whatever form that takes for you. There are many, many different ways to practice meditation, but they all ultimately are about stilling the mind, quieting oneself, centering back to one's true essence. So I think that the more we can do that, if you feel called to do that, I think that it will be a helpful way to deal with what we are experiencing right now. And post-pandemic, there's always going to be a continuation of the noisiness of the world that we live in. I don't think it's going to get quieter anytime soon, unfortunately.
And so regenerating our own energy is definitely something that we need to work on, as you say, work even harder. What, at the scale of the world, what did the past month and years showed us in terms of regeneration? What needs to be regenerated? You address it a lot in your different stories. Can you point some of these aspects that needs to be regenerated?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint just one or two. I think everything needs to be regenerated, to be perfectly honest. I think our entire system is completely broken on every level. I mean, yes, not the same in each country, and each setting has its own history and its own story. Here in America, it's very different than Europe or Germany. We have a system here in America which is built on oppression and slavery and racism. And the cracks of that system are now wide open and have been revealed in a way that they weren't before. So the regeneration, I think regeneration first has to start with the recognition of how broken things are. We can't regenerate until we see that there is a regeneration that is needed. Here in California now we have very intense fires, and there's been a fire burning actually near my home now for the past 2.5 weeks. It's burned 4,500 acres and has been very close to where we live, and we've been under evacuation warnings. And so, that has been at the forefront of my mind, but also this realizing that, fire also is part of regeneration. Yes, it's destructive and it can destroy our homes, especially when we build homes close to a forest, but people understand about how to create a healthy forest over the long term. They understand that it needs to be a fire that is constantly, part of that regenerative cycle. And if you go to a burned landscape, you see that it is often filled with many, many seeds of pine cones here in California, because there are pine trees that litter the landscape, because it is sometimes only through the burning that the seeds for the next generation of trees can be seeded. Now, of course, it's a very dramatic situation, because now we're at a place where we have to have huge firestorms that allow these potential seeds to be seeded. Before, it was a constant cycle of care and attention of getting rid of the undergrowth so that the new seeds could be present and there could be a stable cycle of regrowth. I'm using the fire as a metaphor here to talk about society. Now we have to have huge firestorms that destroy hundreds of thousands of acres and whole towns and cities, and put people at tremendous risk and create tremendous suffering, in order for there to be the space for potential regeneration. And I think that's what we're dealing with, is that we are now having to deal with destruction as the first space to actually allow regeneration to occur. We can't just jump over the hard stuff in order to try to regenerate our society. We can't just say, oh, we want an equitable society, we want a fair society, but we're not going to actually look at the roots of how we became an inequitable and an unfair society. So nothing can escape, I think, the light that needs to be shone on ourselves right now, in our societies and our communities. I think we need to look very, very hard at everything, and I think that COVID has given us an opportunity to do that. It's harder to shy away from all of these issues when they're right in our faces. And I think the shared sense of vulnerability and the shared sense of uncertainty and the shared sense of connection that's happening on a global level gives us an opportunity to do that as a whole planet in a way that we probably haven't really been able to before. I mean, it's really the first time in human history in many ways. Yes, in 1918 there was a flu pandemic, but we didn't have global communication in the same way and connection in the same way. Now we can actually really understand and see what's happening in all parts of the world. And this is the first time that there's been this global event where everybody is in the same set of circumstances to some degree. Yes, many people are suffering more than other people. Some people having food insecurity when others don't. Certain groups are more prone to being impacted by the coronavirus than others. But despite that, there is this shared sense of that we're going through a crisis together. And I think that gives us tremendous opportunity to respond to it together. It doesn't look like that's going to be necessarily happening. It's not like we're all going to say we need to solve this together. There's an opportunity for us all to grow up as a society, and divisions are rampant, especially in my own country. But there is still tremendous opportunity that's present here in this crisis at the moment for regeneration.
For example, the spiritual ecology that you use very often, is that one aspect and one way out, as you describe it?
Yeah, I think there's no one way out of anything anymore. I think we have to think of many ways out. Spiritual ecology is a very, very ancient way of looking at the world. Essentially, it says that everything is alive and sacred, human and non-human, and that it's now time to return to that understanding within the modern context that we live, and that what aspects of spiritual values and spiritual traditions can be integrated with how we respond to the ecological crisis that we're facing. Of course, that ecological crisis is also part of a social crisis and an economic crisis and a political crisis. It's an interwoven crisis of all these different aspects of our lives, and spiritual ecology just is essentially asking us to return to a fundamental way of existence, again, an existence that we had for many, many, many thousands of years. Many indigenous cultures and spiritual traditions and cultures around the world embodied that. And I'm not saying we have to go back to those ancient ways of living, but there is value in those wisdom traditions and in those spiritual traditions and in those ways of living that are relevant now for us to embrace. And so if we can have a sense of reverence for the living world and really, really embody that in our own lives, it's going to shift everything about how we relate to the world around us. Just as if a culture starts to embrace the living world as something to be revered rather than to be looked at as something to exploit for monetary gain, it's going to change every aspect of how we look at the world around us. It's going to shift our economic systems, it's going to shift our social fabric, it's going to shift our political systems. So spiritual ecology is just an invitation to return back to a simple way of being that can shift everything from the individual level to the societal level. It doesn't give a blueprint of how to do all that, because each person is different, each culture is different, and we should never have one way of doing anything. That's always the danger in our modern world, is we like to have a simple delivered solution that we think fits everybody, and that is disastrous. I always like to think of spiritual ecology in the terms of a forest. It's like a healthy forest is filled with many, many different trees, different species, some old, some young, some decaying, and that together they create a healthy system for other creatures to thrive. You have to have so many different trees, just like you have to have so many different stories, just like you have to have so many different perspectives and voices that can make up, whether you want to call it a movement, whether you want to call it, a community, that can support a real shift.
And what are some of the stories that you covered over the past years that have been representing this notion of spiritual ecology?
I mean, everything that we published in Emergence is a reflection of spiritual ecology in different ways. I mean, that's the kind of ethos that we founded the magazine on, which was that, we need stories that explore this philosophy and these values, and these stories need to be diverse. They need to be from people all over the world. They need to represent different, aspects of society and ways of looking at the world. So they could be, something that is very much directly about our environment, or they could be something that's more about society, but or something about personal change. There's many, many, many different stories that we've told that have maybe a more specific lens, but all of them are exploring how these connections are interwoven. And again, are trying to be examples of how we can no longer think of things as separate. So trying to be as diverse and as possible is definitely something we've focused on. There is no one story that is better than the other to express spiritual ecology. It's really about using the power of story to explore all the ways that it's relevant in our lives.
And if you would give a few examples for our audience or people who did not necessarily delve into Emergence work and stories, could you mention some of those that you've been covering that are so fascinating, from Sanctuaries of Silence to Language Keepers? Like, what are some that stick to your mind?
Sure, well, I can use those two as examples. Sanctuaries of Silence is a story about the loss of quiet, the loss of silence in our world, and it focuses on the work of a man named Gordon Hempton, who is an acoustic ecologist, who has been documenting the impact of noise pollution for the past 35 years, and he describes silence as the absence of human-generated noise, and that is what has become endangered over the last few decades, as the sounds of modern life, our cars, our planes, our factories, everything that makes the world hum and come to life, as we call it in a modern sense, creates noise, and that noise drowns out the non-human world. And so the story it's a virtual reality experience that takes you into one of the quietest places on Earth, the Hoh Rainforest, which is in northwest west coast of the United States, in Olympic National Forest, and you're immersed in this quiet space, and in the head that you become the eyes and ears of Gordon Hempton. So you immerse yourself not only in this quiet space, but in his philosophy through his perspective of what it means to connect to silence, and what is lost when we are unable to connect to silence, and also what is gained when we can connect to silence. So that was one very specific way at looking at the importance of connection with the living world. But first we have to understand that what has covered up that connection is noise, and this is just one way that we've done that. One way that we usually don't think about. When you think about all the negative things that happen to the environment, you're usually not thinking about how the impact of noise affects the environment. But it does. Imagine if you're a bird in a forest and you're bombarded by the sounds of mechanized noises, it's going to impact you and your ability to communicate and connect. Not just our ability to find peace by not having the sounds of quiet and the forest sounds permeate our own experience. When we come to the forest, it affects the forest itself. So this story was really an exploration into kind of looking at it from a personal human perspective and also from a non-human perspective, and understanding, you know, the importance of these many, many voices that make up the fabric of existence, the non-human voices that make up the fabric of existence. So that's one example. Language Keepers, you mentioned, was a story we did all about the loss of indigenous languages in California. Here in California, where I live, is actually one of the most diverse places for indigenous languages in the world. And before contact and colonization, there were more than 90 different languages spoken in California from 10 different language families. And these were, you know, very diverse, evolved languages which had grown out of a connection with California over millennia. And in the course of the last 200 years, you know, half of those languages have been wiped out. And so we told the story of 4 different languages in different parts of the state that are at the risk of being lost. They have only a handful of speakers, or in some cases just one speaker remaining. And so it was a look at language revitalization, language loss, and the work of these communities to revitalize their languages. And you know, indigenous languages grew in relationship to place. They're very different than Western languages in that they are place-based. They're very specific, you know, and their relationship to their local ecology and the place is built in there into every aspect of the language. So it's like, if we lose those languages, we lose those connections to place which were inherent in those cultures and the traditional ecological knowledge that is a part of that. And of course, we lose the diversity that makes this planet so remarkable. When we lose a language, we lose a way of communicating. We lose, you know, it's like a star in the sky just went out each time a language is lost. And you know, there are 7,000 languages right now on Earth, but most people speak 23. And so many of those languages are at risk. And it's like each time one of those languages is lost, an aspect of culture is lost, of relationship is lost, and we are left with less ways of understanding and expressing how we relate to each other in the world. And that is deeply, deeply disturbing and deeply sad. And so this story was about that loss, but also about the revitalization and regeneration that these communities are taking against all odds. You know, 1 or 2 speakers who are, you know, aging, who are trying to pass along their language to a new generation of speakers because they feel they have to try to keep their language alive. So it's an inspiring story, but one that is also deeply challenging to learn about as well.
And if you stay just a little bit longer in the stories, you must have met so many people and so diverse, as you just expressed in these 2 examples. But can you remember one that also gave you tremendous hope and a positive feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of them have. You know, I've been really blessed to have been doing this work now for almost 2 decades and traveling to different parts of the world and meeting remarkable people. And rather than choosing one person, because actually no one person comes to mind, there are so many examples. I was always very moved by how, you know, people or communities who were in spaces where they were directly feeling the impacts of our globalized, mechanized, industrialized world, maybe much more so than those of us in more privileged cultures and societies have been experiencing. You know, people at the edges of the world that most people don't care about, don't think about. You know, they don't worry about the impacts that oil drilling has on those communities, or the impacts of climate change on those communities, or the impacts of overfishing on those communities, so on and so on and so on. And you know, I found myself in those places, and I was always so moved by the hope that existed amidst such, you know, such challenge. where these communities are really dealing with the fact that maybe they won't be able to live there in 10 years because the rising seas are going to force them to leave, or their food source is going to dry up because of overfishing, or so on and so on. And it was in those places that hope was so strong. So I was always inspired by that, overcoming tremendous adversity in the face of such challenges. And those stories exist everywhere. The amazing thing about human beings, I've found, is that we can be hopeful in the midst of such darkness,
Yes.
that we can find light in the midst of such darkness, and that we can, we can respond to these challenges. Even when we think there's no hope, we will try and go on. So we all have that within us. And I know we always like to find heroes. And we also always like to choose heroes to aspire to, and heroes are great, but I really think that as we move into this next era, we move beyond the iconic single hero as an example of hope, and we return to the simple truth that there are heroes everywhere, who are overcoming tremendous adversity, and that it is not through idealizing one or two examples that we can find those entry points of connection to see how we can also be part of this new story. They're everywhere, and they're all around us, and they're not famous people. I've always found myself to be much more disappointed by meeting famous people versus meeting real people.
And so, talking about your work and your approach to tell those stories, how do you go after the stories that you've been featuring over the past decades? And what are some of the common threads that you may be seeking? And then perhaps on a more pragmatic level, how do you show and reveal these stories to your readers and your viewers?
You kind of stumble across stories in different ways. Sometimes they just come across your awareness. Someone tells you about somewhere or someone or a story, and it intrigues you, or you're listening to something like with Gordon's story about Sanctuaries of Silence. I heard an interview with him on the radio, and I was fascinated by what he was saying, and did some research, called him up on the phone, and by the end of the phone conversation, I was asking if I could come and visit him and spend time with him in the forest, in the Hoh rainforest. So sometimes you're researching a particular theme because you're interested in wanting to learn about how people are dealing with rising seas as an impact of climate change, and that leads you to learn about a place like the Ile de Jean Charles in southern Louisiana, which is a film I made about when I made the film, it was before they were the first official climate change refugees in the United States, and now they are the first official climate change refugees. But you start looking in one area, and then you just start finding interesting people and places that fascinate you. And I think the role of the storyteller is to always be open and always be listening and always be prepared to go down rabbit holes and explore potential stories. So that's what I've done in these last 20 years, is continue to go around rabbit holes and talk to people and meet people and go places. Sometimes a great film or a story emerges, sometimes one doesn't, but one just has to continue trying. And with the magazine, it's different than my own filmmaking in that we're working with many different artists and writers and filmmakers and photographers, so on. And so it's really about then hearing their ideas and their stories, or sharing an idea and a story that you have with somebody else to maybe go out and tell it. So which is one thing I find very exciting about working in Emergence, is that it really is about working together with a chorus of voices to tell stories versus a singular voice as a storyteller. And I think that yes, a singular voice can be powerful, but to me 20, 30 voices in a room connected singing in harmony is a very powerful thing. If you hear a chorus of 100 people singing, it's an amazing experience versus just one person. And also there's so many different perspectives that are now in that room versus just the singular storyteller. So that's very inspiring to me, is to be able to work with all these artists and storytellers and think of things that I would never have thought of, and bring perspectives that I never could bring to the table. So always keeping your ears and your eyes and your heart open to new perspectives, I think is the ground rule for a storyteller. And then, being willing to take risks and try different things over and over again, and not be afraid to fail if it doesn't work out.
And you shared a lot about where is the status at the moment, not the immediate one, but also in general with all the overfishing at one point, but also to connecting the difficulties that we sometimes have to connect to a place. What is your recommendation where we should now, out of your experience, that large experience in so many different areas, where we should focus on? What is the priority now?
That's a big question, and again, I
have
think
still
that,
some time.
And I'm always reticent again to try to say we should do one thing. It's like, climate change is the big issue we're facing in our generation, but climate change is made up of many, many, many different things, and how we respond to that is made up of many, many, many different things. It depends on where we live. It depends on who we are. It depends on our background. It depends on on so many different facets. So, I always think that, and this comes, going back to my own spiritual tradition and my own spiritual practice, is that any outer action should be a reflection of one's inner state. Meaning that, if one does something outwardly and it's not grounded in something which is inside of us first and foremost, it will not have a firm foundation. It will not come from the deepest part of ourselves. It will not be able to harness our true power as human beings and our true selves. So I think that there needs to be an inner shift in how we relate to the world around us, as much as there needs to be outer changes that reflect that inner reality. Meaning that, if our inner selves is grounded, when I say inner selves, I mean, anything that is not us doing something outwardly, meaning it can be, a quiet reflection of our relationship with the living world, can be, in my opinion, as valuable as shifting how we buy products. Because if we shift what is inside of us and we become connected with the living world around us from an inner place first, everything we do outwardly will naturally have to be a reflection of that inner state. Because if we don't, it's like we are being at odds with who we really are. Doesn't mean it's always easy, but if you make the change within first, then the outer will follow. And I think if we can do one thing as people, it's to make that inner shift. Then the outer will naturally follow. The inner shift will also be directly corresponding to who we are. It will not be one thing, right? It will be many, many, many things for many, many different people. But if we can make that inner shift, then the outer shift will be not only easier, but it will be more meaningful, and it will be more lasting, because it will be grounded in something that has a foundation within ourselves, which is not going to dissipate, in a year when we no longer have the same interest that we did, or because the fad of, buying recycled items has shifted, or whatever it is that might change outwardly. Inward has roots. We need to put down roots inside of ourselves, just like we need to put down roots in relationship to our place.
And talking about inward and who we are, as you say, there is the changes that we can do from within, and there is also developing this notion of perception of the type of contributions that we want to do during this lifetime. It seems that you found that your contribution is to tell stories, as you said, tell stories in dark times. What is this calling for you? Why do you feel this is what you are intending to do right now at these years of your life?
I mean, again, because I've been, working in this space for a number of years, it's what I know how to do. So it may change in the future. Maybe I will no longer want to tell stories and do something else. Who knows? When I was in my teens and early 20s, I was playing music, and that was the medium that I worked in, and then I shifted to film and storytelling, and so that is where I'm at right now in my life, and so I'm drawn to work with the tools that I have and the skills that I have. But you know, I think whether you're a filmmaker or a storyteller, you can still work with and understand the power of story. And story is something that isn't just owned by the storyteller. It's something that is part of the audience, if you will, the people who read a story, listen to a piece of music, to watch a film, whatever the medium may be. It's alive for all of us. And so that's one of the reasons I find storytelling so powerful, is that it is something that involves the community. A story that nobody watches and nobody listens and is really only about the artists themselves might have value to the artist. It might be a credible piece of work, but to me, what makes a story so dynamic is when it comes alive in the reader and it comes alive in the viewer. And then that story takes on so much more meaning, and that meaning grows. And it's like, just like I said, you know, I think of spiritual ecology as a forest. I think of, you know, the power of stories, is that they can seed forests as well. Each story can be a seed which grows, and the more stories that are told can then grow alongside each other. And just like a healthy forest needs trees to create shade for others and a canopy that supports other living presences, a story does the same thing. You know, a story told in isolation is less powerful than a story told in connection with many other stories that reveal those themes and ideas from different perspectives. And so I feel drawn to not only be a storyteller which, you know, plants one seed that can hopefully support others, but to try and support all the other seeds of the other storytellers. And that seems like a good use of myself right now. And so that's all I can do, is just try to respond to what feels like a good use of myself. And then maybe in a few years it'll shift, and, you know, I don't know. But yeah, that was a kind of meandering response.
Did you notice in these variations of telling the story and having different stages from music to film to print now so massively, and you were sharing the example with the hippie, now the stuff what 20 years ago you told is much more elevated and in our daily lives. Did you, from that perspective, from your perspective, see a shift also in the audience?
Yes, I think so. It's just like, to use the hippie example, it's like, you know, when I grew up as a kid, very few people in the West ate hummus, right? In the Middle East, everyone ate hummus, but only hippies in the West ate hummus. Now everybody eats hummus, right? And, you know, I think that there is a change in how people are responding to these ideas that 20 years ago were fringe, hippie, spiritual, kind of left-wing eco ideas, that people have started to recognize the value of a holistic way of looking at things. People recognize the interconnected fabric of life, you know, both in its positive and negative manifestations. So I think the audience has just grown and become much more mainstream. And I think younger people are growing up understanding a lot of this. I mean, if you look at the climate movement, if you look at Greta Thunberg as a kind of symbol for what she represents, it's that there is within her generation an understanding of these values, and also what these values have destroyed in a way that in my generation, older generations, was not there. So I think the audience has grown, and it's very alive in young people. And I think people are kind of saying, yeah, like, obviously this is the way things are, and why can't you wake up to the reality of understanding this? I mean, it's not hard for a lot of younger people to understand that, hey, the world is connected. We should treat it as something that is alive and sacred, and if we don't do that, we're all going to die. I mean, that's Greta Thunberg's message in many ways, you know, and you know, I'm really, in some ways, inspired by that, because it's a huge sea change from 20 years ago, to see this now, and to see this so widespread, and so many people willing to commit their lives to trying to shift the way we live on this planet.
So there's hope.
Yeah, there's definitely hope.
Great.
Yeah, but I think that one thing that I always think about is we can't have naive hope.
Na
I
klar.
think we have to be aware that the situation we're dealing with on every level is very, very dire, and that we can't be hopeful and then pretend things aren't really as bad as they are. I think we can have hope in the midst of darkness, just like I was so inspired to find hope so alive and present in communities where there really shouldn't be any. When I was telling stories at these places in different parts of the world, we can have hope, but I think we have to be honest and realistic about what's ahead of us, and not put our blinders on, especially for those of us who are lucky enough to live in privileged societies or privileged parts of the world where we can not directly experience the impacts of climate change or inequality in the way that others cannot ignore. So there is definitely hope. There is always hope. Human beings always have this incredible ability to be hopeful in the midst of such destruction and despair. I think that's what makes human beings so remarkable.
All right, and last question: what's next for you? What's your next project? What are you currently busy with?
We're working on a new print edition, which will be coming out in December. So looking forward to that and sharing that in the coming months. So that's the immediate main project that we're launching in the next little while.
All right.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you so much for joining us.